Whispers rippled through the packed courtroom, a low murmur of anticipation filling the air. Every gaze was fixed on the defendant's table. After all, it wasn't every day that people got to witness a powerful billionaire stand trial for his crimes. The courtroom doors swung open, and Victor Langston strode in, tall and composed. He carried himself with an air of effortless confidence. His charcoal gray suit was impeccably tailored, his slicked back hair gleaming under the harsh lights. He didn't look like a man on trial for swindling millions from hardworking families. If anything, the half-smirk on his lips and his relaxed gait made him seem more like an honored guest at an exclusive gala than a defendant awaiting judgment. But what truly shocked the courtroom wasn't just his presence, it was his attitude. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Elena Carter," the court officer announced firmly. Chairs scraped against the floor as everyone stood in unison, a silent gesture of respect for the woman who would preside over the case. Everyone except Victor Langston. He remained seated, casually flipping through the pages of a notebook on the table in front of him, not even sparing a glance toward the judge's bench. His attorney leaned in, whispering something urgently in his ear, but Victor merely waved him off with a dismissive flick of his wrist. Judge Carter paused for a brief moment as she reached her seat. Her sharp gaze swept over Victor. Cool and unreadable, she said nothing about his blatant disregard. Instead, her voice remained steady as she addressed the courtroom. "You may be seated." No one could tell what was going through her mind at that moment. But a sudden shift in the air was undeniable. A heavy, unspoken tension settled over the room, a sense that something significant was about to unfold. Victor Langston might have believed that his wealth and influence could shield him from consequences. But today, he was about to learn a lesson that no amount of money could buy. Victor Langston wasn't just a successful businessman, he was the embodiment of wealth and power. His immense fortune afforded him the finest luxuries, extravagant yachts, opulent mansions spread across multiple continents, and an endless string of exclusive parties that the elite desperately vied to attend. On the surface, he was a financial genius, a brilliant investor, a living testament to the American dream. But beneath that polished facade, he was nothing more than a ruthless conman. Langston's investment model was built on promises that were almost too good to resist. He marketed himself as the savior of middle-class families and small businesses, offering them a secure financial future. He guaranteed massive returns, persuading them to invest their entire life savings, their retirement funds, their children's college accounts, even second mortgages on their homes. But in reality, it was all an elaborate Ponzi scheme. He funneled money from new investors to pay off earlier ones, constructing the illusion of unstoppable success. At first, the rapid profits made him appear infallible. Stories spread of investors earning tens of thousands of dollars through Langston's ventures. He was hailed as a financial prodigy, frequently invited to speak at high-profile investment conferences. But when the influx of new money slowed, the cracks in his empire began to show. Hundreds of families lost everything. Retirees found their pensions drained, left with no means to support themselves. Parents were forced to watch their children abandon their college dreams because tuition was suddenly out of reach. Small businesses collapsed, leaving hundreds of workers unemployed. Victor Langston hadn't just stolen their money, he had robbed them of their futures. Their dreams, the stability they had spent a lifetime building. To him, however, it was all just business. He never saw his victims as people, only as fools who were easy to manipulate. When a reporter once asked him about the families who had lost everything to his schemes, Victor had merely shrugged and replied with chilling indifference. They lost because they didn't know how to play the game. Simple as that. He believed he was untouchable. But this time, he had miscalculated his opponent. Because sitting across from him in that courtroom wasn't another gullible investor. It was justice, embodied by Judge Elena Carter. Even as hundreds of families fell into financial ruin, Victor Langston remained utterly unfazed, carrying himself as though nothing had happened. When the investigation into his dealings began, he showed no concern. He believed that with his vast fortune and an elite team of attorneys at his disposal, everything would eventually be taken care of in his favor. In the days following the scandal's exposure, Victor still graced the covers of business magazines, attended lavish parties, and flaunted his extravagant lifestyle on social media. When confronted by reporters about the fraud allegations, he simply smirked and dismissed them. "People are just jealous of my success. When you're rich, everyone wants to tear you down." He never saw his victims as real people suffering in the aftermath of his crimes. To him, they were nothing more than insignificant numbers on a financial spreadsheet. As public outrage mounted, Victor remained unshaken. He poured money into hiring the best lawyers, ones who could twist the truth, exploit legal loopholes, and delay the trial with endless procedural tactics. He filed motion after motion to postpone court proceedings, citing everything from personal health issues to alleged flaws in the investigation. Each delay pushed the case further back, testing the patience of his victims, who grew more desperate by the day. The media dubbed it a race against justice, a calculated effort by Victor Langston to evade consequences for as long as possible. He doubled down on his PR campaigns, attempting to rebrand himself as a misunderstood entrepreneur, a victim of an overzealous legal system. "I did nothing wrong," he declared in an exclusive interview. "I was the only one willing to invest in their dreams. If they lost money, that's on them, not me." While his victims struggled to make ends meet, Victor continued to indulge in luxury. He hosted yacht parties, vacationed at exclusive resorts, and acted as though his legal troubles were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. And for a while, it seemed like he was right. The media's attention shifted to new scandals, and Victor convinced himself that if he stalled long enough, the world would eventually forget about his crimes. But what he failed to anticipate was that this trial would be unlike any other he had faced. Because this time, seated across from him was Judge Elena Carter, a woman who could not be bought, and whose sense of justice could not be swayed. The official trial began, and the courtroom was packed. It wasn't just journalists eager for a headline. Many of Victor Langston's victims had come to witness firsthand the man who had destroyed their lives finally face justice. Among them, seated quietly in the gallery, were Angela Moreno and Peter Harris. The pain they carried was etched into their faces, a silent testament to all they had lost. Angela Moreno, a single mother of 3, had once owned a small coffee shop in her neighborhood. When she heard about Victor Langston's promising investment opportunity, she had poured every last dollar into it, including a second mortgage on her home, hoping to expand her business and secure a better future for her children. But within months, her money was gone, her coffee shop shut down, her house was foreclosed. There were nights when she and her children had to sleep in their car because they had nowhere else to go. Peter Harris, a retired firefighter who had spent over 30 years risking his life for his community, had suffered just as much. He had carefully saved every penny for his retirement, dreaming of peaceful golden years. But after listening to Victor Langston's pitch about foolproof investments, he had placed his full trust and life savings into the scheme. Then, overnight, it all vanished. At 65, Peter was left with nothing but crushing debt. Unable to support himself, he had no choice but to move in with his younger brother, crammed into a tiny apartment. When Angela took the witness stand, her hands trembled as she clutched a small piece of paper with notes. She tried to steady herself, but her voice wavered with raw emotion. "I trusted him. I thought this was my chance to give my children a better life. But then I realized it was all a lie. He didn't just take my money, he took my dreams, my future. Do you have any idea what it's like to watch your children sleep in a car, asking why they don't have a home anymore? Do you?" The courtroom fell silent. Some people bowed their heads, others discreetly wiped away tears. But among them, one person remained utterly unaffected: Victor Langston. He didn't look at Angela. He didn't listen. He simply leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes lazily scanning his phone screen, as if her words weren't worth his attention. The prosecutor immediately spoke up. "Your Honor, the defendant is openly disrespecting these proceedings. He won't even listen to the testimony." All eyes turned to Judge Elena Carter. Her expression remained unchanged, but her gaze hardened. "Mr. Langston," she said, her voice cool and firm, "put the phone down, now." Victor exhaled dramatically and cast an amused glance at the judge. "I was just checking something important," he drawled, holding up his phone as if it were some kind of joke. Judge Carter didn't repeat herself. She simply stared at him in silence. The tension in the room thickened, pressing down on everyone present. Slowly, Victor placed the phone on the table, But the smug smirk never left his lips. Then, Peter Harris took the stand. Unlike Angela, he didn't cry, his hands didn't shake, his voice was steady, low, and laced with quiet fury. 35 years, he began. I ran into burning buildings to save people I'd never met. I never imagined that, in my old age, I'd lose everything because I trusted a man like him. He turned to Victor Langston, his eyes blazing with anger. You burned my future to the ground. Langston, you destroyed the hopes of countless people. But today, I stand here, watching you face judgment, and I hope, just for a moment, you feel even a fraction of the pain you've caused us. A ripple of agreement moved through the courtroom. Nods of understanding, quiet murmurs of support, furious glares directed at Victor Langston. But Victor? He just shrugged, as if none of it mattered, as if their pain was nothing more than background noise. He still believed he would win. He still believed that no matter how many accusations were thrown at him, no matter how many tears were shed, he would walk out of that courtroom untouched. But he was wrong, and very soon, he would realize just how wrong he was. The trial stretched into its third day. One by one, witnesses stepped forward, each carrying their own painful story of how Victor Langston had shattered their lives. The evidence against him continued to mount. But the most shocking aspect of the trial wasn't the overwhelming proof of his crimes, it was his own demeanor. Victor Langston showed no sign of concern. Throughout the proceedings, he lounged back in his chair, occasionally smirking as the prosecution presented their case. He tapped away at his phone under the table, exchanged whispered jokes with his attorney, and even yawned at times, as if the entire trial was nothing more than a dull performance. But what truly left the courtroom in stunned silence was his reaction when a critical piece of evidence was revealed. The prosecutor picked up a thick stack of documents and spoke firmly. Your Honor, we would like to present internal emails in which the defendant, Victor Langston, personally instructed his employees to falsify financial reports and deceive investors. She walked to the witness stand and began reading one of the emails aloud. Make the numbers look good. We need these stupid chickens to sign as soon as possible. A heavy silence filled the room. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Some victims bowed their heads. Others clenched their fists in quiet rage. But the most shocking moment wasn't the email itself. It was Victor Langston's reaction. He laughed. A slow, mocking smirk crept onto his face, his shoulders shaking ever so slightly in amusement. The prosecutor's brow furrowed as she stepped closer. Mr. Langston, do you recognize this email? Before he could respond, his attorney shot up from his seat. Objection. This question was already addressed in the pre-trial hearing. All eyes turned to Judge Elena Carter. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her silence alone commanded attention. Then, in a calm yet authoritative tone, she delivered her ruling. Overruled. The defendant will answer the question. Victor leaned back in his chair, raising an eyebrow as if savoring the attention. He reached for the microphone, tilting his head slightly before speaking with deliberate arrogance. Oh, of course I recognize it, he said smoothly, but let's not blow things out of proportion. That's just business talk. You wouldn't understand. The courtroom erupted in outrage. A woman in the front row burst into tears. An elderly man shook his head, his hands trembling with anger. Order. Judge Carter's voice rang out, sharp and unwavering. She struck her gavel once, instantly silencing the room. Then, she turned her piercing gaze back to Victor Langston. Mr. Langston, I strongly suggest you reconsider your attitude. This is not a boardroom. This is a court of law. But Victor only shrugged. Really? Because to me, it feels like a reality TV show. Everyone's overreacting. Gasps filled the room. Some jurors exchanged incredulous glances. Even his own lawyer tensed beside him. Judge Carter's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened. She let the silence stretch, letting the weight of his words settle in. Then, finally, she spoke, and though her words were quiet, they carried undeniable force. You may mock your victims. You may dismiss the legal system. But I assure you, you will not escape the consequences of your actions. No one knew what was going through her mind at that moment. But one thing was certain. Victor Langston's game was coming to an end. And this time, he wasn't going to win. The day of sentencing had finally arrived. The courtroom was packed, not a single seat left unfilled. Victor Langston's victims sat in the front rows, their faces tight with a mixture of tension and hope. After days of testimony, this was the moment that mattered most, the moment justice would be served. At the defendant's table, Victor Langston sat with his usual air of confidence. He wore a freshly tailored suit, his hair perfectly styled, and the familiar smirk still lingered on his lips. He didn't believe the law could touch him. He had seen men like himself walk away unscathed, their wealth and connections shielding them from consequences. He was convinced he would be no exception. Judge Elena Carter entered, her face betraying no emotion. As she took her seat, the silence in the courtroom became so profound that one could hear a pin drop. She flipped through the documents in front of her before slowly lifting her gaze, locking eyes with Victor Langston. Then, with a voice that was clear, steady, and authoritative, she delivered the verdict. Mr. Victor Langston, after reviewing all evidence and witness testimony, this court finds you guilty on all counts, including financial fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of justice. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Some victims clenched their hands together. Others nodded quietly, but Victor Langston barely reacted, offering nothing more than a bored arch of his brow. Judge Carter continued, her tone unwavering. Throughout this trial, you have displayed nothing but contempt toward your victims, toward this court, and toward the very concept of justice itself. You have shown no remorse. You have treated these proceedings as nothing more than a game, and the suffering of others as meaningless. But today, your game ends. Victor remained motionless, but for the first time, his smirk faltered ever so slightly. Therefore, Judge Carter declared, I hereby sentence you, Victor Langston, to 25 years in federal prison. No possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted. Gasps filled the air. Some victims burst into tears, unable to contain their relief. Others exchanged stunned glances, as if they hadn't dared to believe this day would come. But no one was more shocked than Victor Langston himself. He froze for a second, then abruptly shot to his feet. What, 25 years? You've got to be kidding me, he shouted, his face flushed with fury. Judge Carter remained completely unshaken. I'm not finished, Mr. Langston. The room fell dead silent once more. In addition to your prison sentence, she continued, I am ordering the full seizure and liquidation of your assets. Every dollar you stole will be returned to the victims you defrauded. A choked sob came from the front row. Angela Moreno clapped a trembling hand over her mouth as tears streamed down her face. Beside her, Peter Harris gave a slow, solemn nod, as if, after all these years, he could finally breathe. But Victor Langston wasn't finished. He slammed his fists onto the table, his voice rising in a furious snarl. You can't do this. I am Victor Langston. I'll appeal this. I'll ruin your career. Judge Carter didn't flinch. She simply raised her gavel and brought it down with a single, decisive strike. Mr. Langston, this is my courtroom, and in this courtroom, justice will be served. Two officers stepped forward, placing firm hands on Victor's shoulders, signaling for him to sit. But he thrashed against their grip, still shouting, still refusing to accept reality. This isn't over. I have money. I have power. You think you can lock me away? Judge Carter met his desperate gaze with the calm of someone who had already won. Mr. Langston, she said coolly, as of today, you have neither. A moment later, the officers pulled him away from the table, restraining him as he struggled. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the silent courtroom. Then, as Victor Langston was led away, the silence shattered, this time, by applause. It wasn't just a legal victory. It was proof. Proof that justice could still reach the untouchable. Proof that no one, not even the wealthiest, the most powerful, was above the law. And today, every person in that room knew, Victor Langston was no longer the one in control. As Judge Elena Carter's final words echoed through the courtroom, Victor Langston sat frozen, as if his mind refused to process what had just happened. Then, in an instant, he shot to his feet, his furious gaze sweeping across the room, searching for someone, anyone, to blame. No, this is a joke. I refuse to accept this, he bellowed, his voice laced with fury. He spun toward his attorney, his face flushed red with rage. Do something. File an appeal. I am not going down like this. The once confident lawyer remained silent. He knew the truth. There was no escaping this. The evidence was too overwhelming. An appeal would be nothing more than a delay of the inevitable. But Victor refused to accept reality. He turned back to Judge Carter, his eyes blazing with hatred. "You think you can destroy me?" he snarled. "I won't let this stand. Do you even know who I am? I have money. I have power. I can take everything from you." A tense hush fell over the courtroom. But Judge Carter remained unmoved. She met his rage with a calm, unwavering stare, her authority cutting through his tantrum like a blade. "Mr. Langston," she said evenly, "I suggest you start accepting reality. This is no longer your game. And you will no longer manipulate the law to serve your own interests." Victor's jaw clenched, his fists slamming onto the table. Instantly, the officers standing beside him stepped forward, their hands hovering near his arms, ready to intervene. He struggled, resisting, as if sheer force of will could undo what had been done. But for the first time in his life, Victor Langston realized that money couldn't save him, that no loophole, no backroom deal, no high-priced lawyer could make this go away. And for the first time in his life, he was the one with no control. Not a single person in the courtroom pitied him. Not one. Instead, a quiet exhale of relief rippled through the spectators. Then, slowly, a few soft claps broke the silence, until the applause grew louder. A solemn yet powerful acknowledgement that justice had finally prevailed. Angela Moreno let out a shaky sob. But this time, it wasn't from grief, it was from relief. She turned to Peter Harris, who gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white, before finally nodding in quiet satisfaction. "We won," Peter whispered. Meanwhile, Victor continued to thrash as the officers secured the handcuffs around his wrists. "I'll be back," he shouted, his voice filled with desperation and venom. "You'll all regret this. Every single one of you is a damn fool." But this time, no one was listening. The officers led him away, his shouts growing fainter as he was marched toward the exit. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the hushed courtroom, each step sealing his fate. Then, as the heavy doors swung shut behind him, it was over. And as they closed, a new chapter began, one of justice, hope, and the promise of a fresh start for those he had tried to ruin. As the courtroom doors closed behind Victor Langston, an eerie silence settled over the room. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. It was as if they were still trying to grasp the reality that the man who had ruined so many lives had finally been held accountable. Then, a single pair of hands clapped. Another followed. And then, like a rising tide, the applause swelled into a wave of sound, relieved, cathartic, unstoppable. Angela Moreno stood near the witness stand, tears streaming down her face. But this time, they weren't tears of grief, they were tears of release. She turned and embraced the woman beside her, another victim of Victor Langston, someone who had lost everything just like she had. Peter Harris, the retired firefighter who had seen his entire retirement savings stolen, let out a slow breath. He nodded to himself, his gaze distant, as if replaying all the losses he had endured. Finally, he murmured, finally, someone like him had to pay. Outside the courthouse, dozens of reporters stood waiting, microphones and cameras raised, eager to capture the reactions of those most affected. The moment Angela stepped through the doors, a journalist rushed forward. "Ms. Moreno, can you share how you feel about today's verdict?" Angela hesitated for a moment before answering. "I don't know how to put it into words," she admitted. "I feel relieved, but I also know that no sentence can ever truly give us back what we lost. Money can be repaid, but the years of pain, the sleepless nights, the dreams that were stolen, it will take a long time to heal from that." Beside her, Peter Harris spoke up. "I don't care about the financial compensation," he said. "What matters is the message this trial sends. No one, no matter how rich, no matter how powerful, is above the law." The story of Victor Langston spread rapidly across news outlets, turning into a cautionary tale of greed, corruption, and the downfall of those who believed they were untouchable. But more than that, it became a beacon of hope for those who had once thought justice was beyond their reach. Judge Elena Carter, the woman who had stood firm against every legal trick and intimidation tactic, gave no statements to the press. She quietly returned to her chambers, standing by her window and watching the crowd below. There was no pride or self-congratulation in her expression, only steadfast resolve. She understood that justice was rarely easy, But sometimes, a single fair verdict could shift the way society viewed power and accountability. A few weeks later, a letter was published in a local newspaper. It was written by Angela Moreno's young daughter. Addressed to Judge Carter. "Thank you for standing up for my mom and the others. Because of you, we can believe in tomorrow again. Justice isn't something far away, it's something we have to fight for." The trial had ended, but its echoes remained. A reminder that justice was not just an abstract idea, but a tangible force, one that required courage, persistence, and the will to protect it. The trial of Victor Langston was more than just the sentencing of a fraudster. It was a powerful reminder that justice cannot be bought with wealth or influence. The people who lost everything to his greed may never fully recover what was taken from them. But at the very least, they found closure, a recognition that their suffering was real, that they were not alone, and that the system had not abandoned them. But the 25-year prison sentence and the complete seizure of Langston's assets were not just about punishing one man. They sent a message far beyond the walls of that courtroom. No one is above the law. In a world where the rich and powerful often manipulate the system to escape accountability, this case stood as undeniable proof that truth and justice could still prevail. Yet justice is not solely the responsibility of judges and lawyers. It belongs to everyone. If not for the courage of victims like Angela Moreno and Peter Harris, if not for the relentless pressure from the public, Victor Langston might have walked free, continuing his lavish lifestyle without consequence. So the question remains, how many more Victor Langstons are out there? And more importantly, what will we do to ensure they are held accountable? This was never just a trial, it was a wake-up call. A society is only truly just when everyone, regardless of wealth or status, is judged by the same laws. And if we want justice to exist, we cannot sit back and wait for it. We must stand up and fight for it.